My true story. From Florida, my son said, "We're overweight for luggage. Just take the next flight, Mom." Then they left with the inheritance ring in his wife's purse. So I boarded a different flight to my lawyer's office. I stood in line at the airline check-in desk in Miami, gripping my purse so tightly I thought my fingers might crack. Greg pulled two heavy rolling suitcases, his designer shirt crisp and unwrinkled, as if he were negotiating a high-value contract rather than checking luggage for a vacation. Heather hovered beside him, her fingers tapping restlessly on her phone screen, never lifting her head to look at me. "Mom," Greg said, voice quiet but clear, "it's basic math, you or the golf clubs. And the clubs are worth more." For a moment I thought he was joking. I managed a weak smile. Heather did not laugh. "She can't even walk fast," Heather said, her eyes flicking toward me like I was a broken piece of baggage no one wanted. "How is she going to survive a transatlantic flight? We'll end up paying for a medical diversion over the Atlantic and miss Paris entirely." Greg shrugged, as if he were shrugging off a forgotten bag. "Well, rebook her. Let her fly next week. Business class was tight anyway." I opened my mouth to protest, to remind them that I carried their childhoods, but Heather cut in sharply. "Honestly, she's dead weight, always has been. Just quieter now." She laughed, just a soft, cruel sound, as if she had delivered the cleverest joke of the century. I bent to pick up my purse, my hand trembling, and that's when I saw it. The inheritance ring, my mother's ring, faded gold, a small worn gemstone, yet unmistakable, and the engraving inside still visible, till truth, not just death. Writer, I had never given it to anyone. I had never even let Heather touch it, and yet now, it was on her finger, as if it were spoils, her spoils. I asked in a husky voice, "That ring, where did you get it?" Heather did not bother to look back. "Oh, this? Greg said it was just sitting in your drawer, so I'm putting it to good use. Sentimental stuff doesn't look good with age anyway." Greg glanced between us, smirk faint. "You weren't wearing it. What's the point of keeping it if no one sees it?" Heather had once mocked its age, but now she wore it like proof she had won. I stared at them. This son who once held my hand at 5 years old when he was afraid of the dark. I stared at them. This son who once held my hand at 5 years old when he was afraid of the dark. This daughter-in-law who once had my hand on her womb the day she gave birth. And now, they stood here sipping coffee and mocking me, while I was relegated to a silent witness. Heather handed me a boarding pass marked "Standby." "If there's space, you'll fly tomorrow. If not, wait another day. It's flexible." They turned to leave. No hug, no goodbye. Just before stepping through security, Heather spun back and said, "Enjoy the lounge, maybe read a book about boundaries." She emphasized those last two words like a knife. Greg added, without facing back, "We'll call when we land. Or not, roaming is expensive." The glass doors closed behind them, and I stood there in the airport terminal. No tears, no fury, just silence. The only weapon they had not learned to fear. I remember the smell of the terminal. Coffee and jet exhaust, recycled air tinged with perfume and fear. I could see the runway beyond the windows, planes sliding across tarmac like huge, silent birds. I wondered if I might simply disappear into the gray horizon. But my hands gripped my purse. Inside, I carried more than personal items. I carried a photograph of a little girl with missing front teeth holding a daisy, the same granddaughter who now never offered me her crumbs. And I carried a small manila folder, the one container my entire life used to fill with legal deeds, insurance papers, bank signatures. Greg and Heather never thought to ask about it because they assumed I had nothing left. Now, I opened it carefully. Inside was the original deed to our home in Florida, freshly stamped, freshly recorded. The owner name, not mine anymore, instead, a non-profit I had quietly founded, the Grandmother's Endowment for Ecological Justice. The transfer date, 3 weeks ago, my birthday. The same afternoon, Heather had told me she was overwhelmed with work and would call later. The same morning, Greg had sent an e-card with just those 2 words, "Happy Retirement." I had spent that morning alone in the kitchen, baking lemon cookies, placing them in neat rows on a tray, as if expecting someone to walk through that front door for once. No one came. Then I left. I boarded a flight, not to Europe, but to my lawyer's office. I closed the folder, zipped it back into my purse. A flight attendant passed offering shortbread. I declined. Another hour passed. The lounge staff rotated. The woman who had greeted me earlier was gone. A young man with gelled hair and polite discomfort approached, asked whether I was waiting for someone. I smiled softly. No. Then I turned back to the window again. Outside, a new flight prepared for takeoff, its lights blinking against a darkening sky. Inside me, something steadier than anger began to grow. They thought I was excess baggage, unclaimed, forgettable. But baggage gets lost. I do not. They thought I was too fragile to matter, disposable in their equation for legroom and duty-free souvenirs. But I was the last thing they would ever unpack. They expected screams, but I brought silence with proof. I looked at my reflection in the glass. Wrinkles, gray hair, eyes like steel. I had delivered 73 babies in military tents, patched wounds with trembling hands, said goodbye to a husband buried under foreign soil. They thought this lounge confrontation was an ending. For me, it was page 1. I whispered to the reflection, voice steady. They think I am excess baggage, but I am the one thing they cannot carry, cannot bury, cannot leave behind. Then I stood and walked out. It was time to go home. I was born in Tampa, Florida, in a modest house painted seafoam green, not far from the bay. I grew up thinking life was quiet and kind. When I turned 18, the war in Southeast Asia pulled me into nursing school. I became a military medic and later a midwife. I delivered babies in field tents, patched wounds under mortar fire, and watched mothers breathe again. I carried my uniform home with pride, and when I came home for good, I left the service and opened a small clinic in our town. I married young, found stability in raising our son Greg, and slowly built the house where I have lived for 50 years. The house was paid off, the yard full of magnolia trees, and the mortgage was the only thing I ever signed, with trembling excitement, a promise that our family had roots in Florida. My mother's ring came into my possession on the day she died, under the orange trees out back. It was old, yellow, gold, and slightly etched from decades of wear, with a small emerald at its center. Inside, in my grandmother's shaky handwriting, were engraved the words, "Till truth, not just death," my mother said to me that day. Truth binds us beyond the grave, not the weight of a coffin. I wore that ring for 30 years, on holidays, at graduations. When I stood beside Greg's bedside when he was sick, it was private, a covenant that memory, with truth, endures. Greg arrived in our lives like a sunbeam, golden-haired and curious. I taught him to read under the magnolia blossoms. I held his hand each time the thunder frightened him. When he fell ill at age 7 with pneumonia, I slept in a chair beside his bed, rubbing his forehead and whispering old lullabies. Always I believed my love was enough. As he grew, he chased scholarships and dreams. I stood beside him, first paying tuition, then attending parent, pension nights, then clapping at his college graduation. Yet somewhere along the road, his gratitude became silent. He thanked me less. He stopped calling unless he needed help. Heather entered our world when Greg called me one evening, voice trembling with something I recognized too well, pride mixed with fear. He said, "Mama, meet Heather. She's the one." I welcomed her with open arms. She wore heels even in the house. She painted the walls pastel, brightened every corner. She declared artistic vision for the garden, gave grand dinner parties. At first, she seemed grateful. She kissed my cheek, whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," whenever I offered a casserole or extra linens. Then the changes came slowly. The Christmas photo I had snapped of Greg and Heather became cleaner each year, no pictures in my living room. My knitting basket was moved to the garage to make space for her vintage accent chairs. My grandmother's paintings were replaced by floating shelves with her curated coffee table books. And still she smiled, all charm, all invitation. She said, "I want everyone to feel welcome," but only her friends stayed. Heather's true colors emerged one afternoon when I offered her the ring. I explained its history, my mother's memory, the engraving. She said with a tight grin, "It belongs in a museum, not on my finger." That night I found the ring missing. I asked Greg politely. He said he thought it had been misplaced somewhere. I should look again. I looked. In drawers, in jewelry boxes, behind framed photos, nothing. I nearly wept. I learned to keep grief quiet, to iron his shirts and feed his dog while pieces of me vanished. The motivations behind their cruelty were obvious if you looked closely. After Heather became invested in Greg's financial advisor company, the flow of money shifted. There were whispers that Heather disliked the old tax code, disliked the fact that the house value dropped their deductions. She preferred new investments, liquid, flashy, relocatable. She needed to purge old burdens. I was spoken of as dead weight, fragile, emotionally messy. Greg would call me to ask about appointments or medical schemes, but he never asked about memories or ancestry. He rarely asked how I felt, yet they never accounted for me owning the house outright, for the clinic building in my name, for stocks in their family business being under my signature. I had been meticulous, changing beneficiary designations, adding co-signers for medical power of attorney, scanning documents and sending them to safe deposit boxes. I wrote letters to my lawyer friend Thomas years ago. I told him, "One day you will help me protect this lineage." He wrote back, "Always." By the time Greg and Heather made plans for their Europe trip, I already knew they considered me disposable. They spoke while I wasn't in the room. "Just wait till we liquidate her estate. It will prop up the kids' college fund. If she's gone, we can sell the clinic," they strategized. And I listened. So by the time we reached the airport betrayal, I was ready. Not with anger, but with calmness, rooted in preparation, and decades of love turned quiet vigilance. I had history, I had truth, and enough love for myself to carry truth beyond the grief they expected to bury me under. I settled into a worn leather chair in the VIP lounge, my standby boarding pass crumpled between my fingers, and listened to the distant hum of departure announcements. My heart should have hurt, but instead I felt only stillness. I watched families reunite, business class passengers walk by without a backward glance, and I allowed their movements to calm me. They thought they had sent me away. I was still right where I needed to be, thinking. I reached into my purse and fingered the small manila folder I carried. The deed, documentation, stock certificates, all neatly arranged. I flipped through them slowly, as if reading the script of a life they believed they'd dismissed. Outside the lounge windows, the sun slid toward evening, painting the tarmac in bruised gold. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Thomas. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I knew how to find him. He answered on the third ring, his voice steady and warm. "Leah, hello." "Thomas, you saved me once," I said. "You taught me what it meant to fight." "Yes," he replied softly, "and I still will." I told him what had happened, how they'd given me a standby ticket and left me at a check-in desk, how Heather now wore the ring that belonged to my mother. I told him I had the deed, that I had prepared, and that I would need his help tonight. He paused, then said firmly, "I'm on it." I set the phone down and closed my eyes. I pictured him decades ago, ragged and bruised as a boy, on my front porch after his mother struck him again. I patched his chin, held him in my arms, and whispered that he would be more than what he suffered. Year later, I'd received a letter telling me he had gone to law school. I kept it in this same folder. The lounge shrank around me as resolve filled the space. I slipped a hand into my purse and touched the deed again, felt the embossed paper. I imagined the way the signatory line looked beside my name, and beside the nonprofit name I had quietly created. All the steps I had taken when the world still regarded me as harmless. I reached for water. My reflection in the glass showed steady eyes, not defeat. I remembered the first night I arrived at my clinic in Florida, unpacking boxes, cleaning floors, taking on debt to make care available for the women who had lost husbands in wars. I remembered teaching Greg to read under the magnolia tree. I remembered the day I wore my mother's ring to his wedding. I remembered every moment I believed family meant family. I opened my phone's notes app. I checked my flight status, no seat yet, standby, unlikely tonight. I looked at the next flights to Florida, none affordable, none immediate. I closed the app and deleted the browser tab, showing hotels near the airport. Even then, I felt something tightening in me. Containment. Not panic, but focus. I flagged an email draft. "Meeting Thomas at 9 p.m. tonight. Do not board Europe." I wrote, "I choose another kind of journey." Then I deleted it. I would not send it. I did not want them to know I was abandoning their plan. I wanted them to believe I was stranded, They would call later and wonder why I did not arrive. I watched Heather's heels clicking past the glass wall, saw Greg's face through the window light as they walked back toward security, impenetrable, drifting away, and I thought, they believe they erased me from tonight. They could not have been more wrong. I rose from the chair, smoothed down my coat. I picked up the folder, the ring, my keys. I left the lounge with purpose. I passed through security using my ID, not the boarding pass. I stepped into the terminal, into buzz and motion, and walked, it felt like breathing, to the taxi stand outside. I did not call them. I did not text. I did not cry. Silence was my weapon. I whispered to myself, I am not forgotten. I never was. When I told the driver take me to Thomas's office, he asked if I wanted baggage. I laughed quietly. Just me and my convictions. He drove off into dusk, leaving the airport behind. I watched the planes still landing and taking off, my old life departing that terminal. I felt no fear, only anticipation. I was boarding a flight after all. Not to Europe, not to their world, but to justice. I stepped into the taxi at dusk, pressing the folder closer into my lap, aware of every breath in the city air. The driver asked, politely, where to? I said, Thomas Higgins, downtown. The moment the tires rolled onto the highway, felt like the first beat of a drum, steady, inevitable. I thought of the airport fading behind me, the glass doors swallowing the last of Greg and Heather. My pulse was measured. I had not cried, I had not panicked, I had only prepared. Thomas's office was a modest brick building. Ivy curled up the exterior. The brass nameplate on the door read, Thomas E. Higgins, Attorney at Law. Inside, it smelled of aged books and leather. He greeted me at reception, older now, but his eyes bright, recognition and pride flickering. I nodded. He led me to his study room, heavy wooden desk, floor-to-ceiling shelves of legal volumes. He sat immediately, gestured to the papers. I handed him the folder. I'm staying in town, I said quietly. I have work. He did not act surprised. He began sorting. The original deed to the house, the corporate share certificates in my name, bank account designations listing me as co-owner, the business trust paperwork. He flipped open a folder and frowned. Look at this, he said. They moved most of your assets into a family LLC, signed over your shares on your behalf. I leaned in. Without my consent? I see your signature, but I do not see your conscious assent. Just their names as power of attorney. He taps the deed. And this property deed? Recently amended. You are no longer listed. I felt my chest tighten. Then you already know, I said. They intended to erase me. Thomas nodded, methodical. He placed documents before me. Charts of ownership, dates of transfers, financial arrangements. They had even refiled my clinic ownership under a new entity, so that it no longer appeared in my personal name. That allowed them to allocate it to heirs later, without me. I exhaled. We change that, I declared. I want this house, those shares, that clinic, everything to go into a foundation. They cannot liquidate, cannot sell. I want it to serve others. He paused, his pen hovering. What would you call it? I managed a faint smile. Widows Who Remember Foundation. A place for older women, widows, survivors, overlooked, so they would not lose their voices, their homes, their dignity. Thomas began drafting. He worked through the night, while I watched documents take shape. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, mission statement, donor restrictions stating no sale of assets. Assets revert to state if mission is violated. No beneficiaries except widows, previously erased. The Foundation's board, with me as honorary chair, comptroller protections to prevent Greg or Heather from ever profiting. As ink dried, he looked over his glasses. This is airtight. Frankly, they will not see this one coming. We stepped into the small kitchen adjacent to his office. I brewed tea. He asked if I'd like sugar. I said no. I let him talk, walking me through court filings, property transfer protocols, non-profit requirements. We drafted letters to county clerks, tax authorities, everything strategic, quiet, invisible to those who assumed they had erased me. At some point after midnight, the phone rang. I did not flinch. Thomas answered. Thomas Higgins. I saw his eyes narrow as he listened. When he looked at me, I was ready. He set the phone down. That was Heather. She wants to know where you are. I sat back. Tell her I am not going to Europe. He nodded, picked up the phone again. Heather? This is Leah. I'm not going to Europe. I'm going home. His voice echoed through the line, calm and detached. I withdrew into a corner of the dim office. Thomas continued drafting. I could hear the clock ticking toward morning. I held the folder, but now it felt different, lighter, purposeful. It took 6 days. 6 days of filings, notarizations, overnight couriers. By the time they landed, the gate bore a different name. By dawn, the foundation legal file was ready. Thomas printed everything. He asked me to sign multiple pages. My hands did not shake. I signed. Each stroke felt like reclamation. We arranged courier pickup for the deed and bank documentation destined for the foundation. We prepared filings to reinstate my ownership, void the transfers they had made under assumed authority. We nosed through the small print of corporate documents to add reversal clauses. Thomas looked at me. They can still contest, he warned. Maybe they will, I replied simply. But they will not win. He drafted a short letter from me to Greg to Heather, letting them know my location and intent. It would be delivered after they returned. I did not read it out loud. When I walked out of his office near first light, I felt the office hum shift around me. The legal weight I stood on was now anchored in paperwork no one could ignore. As I stepped into the crisp air of morning, I felt the first true breeze outside justice. The fight was coming, but I was prepared. I got into a waiting car with papers secured in legal tubes at my feet. It drove me away from downtown. The dawn rose pale and unwavering. My eyes shimmered, not with tears or regret, but with conviction. I was going home, to a house that was no longer mine in name, but would soon be mine again in purpose. Because in that foundation, in those documents, I had forged something stronger than memory. I had forged truth. I arrived home in Florida just after dawn. The taxi pulled up to dusty magnolia trees and the gate I once left open for my family. The driver hesitated and shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the gate is locked and there's a big notice. I can't go in." He offered to help me with my suitcase on the sidewalk. I nodded, ignoring the sense of déjà vu. He had become a stranger holding my things outside the threshold of my own life. Greg and Heather returned that evening. They walked toward the front gate, dragging their suitcases and talking about ski lifts, crepes in the Alps, selfies in front of Notre Dame. Greg checked his phone for photos. Heather chirped about the boutique hotel with marble bathrooms. They walked toward the front gate, dragging their suitcases and talking about crepes in Paris, then skiing in the Alps. The perfect European loop, Heather called it. A clean brass plaque shone in the fading sunlight. Property of the women they tried to erase. Beneath it, in smaller letters, property of the women they tried to erase. A project by widows who remember. They stared. Greg with pursed lips, Heather's face blanched like white paint underwater. Heather knocked once on the gate rail. "Hello? Anybody here?" No one answered. The front door, visible through windows, had eyewash marring the glass. A lockbox glinted at waist height. Potted plants lined the porch. Not dusty magnolia blossoms, but begonias, clearly tended. The shrubs trimmed within a week. Heather's confident smile faltered. Greg set down his bags slowly. He dialed 911, speaking with measured voice. "Yes, we are the owners, homeowners, just returned from Europe." A polite pause. "There's a locked gate preventing entry." A longer pause. "Yes, my wife and I, we live here." 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. They climbed out of a patrol car, opened the gate themselves. They crossed to the porch. Heather tried to explain. "We've been traveling. We own this house. My mother-in-law owns it. Grandmother, Leah." She waved toward windows. "She's inside. We just can't get in." The senior officer placed gloved fingers above the brass plaque. "Lady, we ran the deed. This property is registered to a nonprofit foundation. Neither of your names are listed." He looked at me through the glass door. I stood behind the lace curtain, silhouette firm. They landed in Miami 7 days after the betrayal. They thought nothing had changed. Heather burst into tears, voice shrill. "We're ruined. You can't do this. I had my wedding chapel saved. I had plans for the backyard." Greg's jaw clenched. He looked from Heather to me, silent until the officer turned away to explain tax implications. The younger officer looked over his shoulder. Your names do not appear anywhere in current ownership records. This is legal, I'm sorry, Heather wailed. But this is our family home. I stepped from behind the curtain, walking down the porch steps slowly. My cane clicked on the wood planks. I reached the bottom step and paused. Greg and Heather faced me, like two strangers in the twilight. I wore the same pale coat I had worn at the airport, and I carried nothing but a folder. Heather's eyes were red, rimmed. Greg's expression flickered between anger and confusion. I looked at them, calmly. You didn't knock, I said evenly, because you knew you did not belong anymore. Heather stuttered. You, how, who? I raised a hand. Property deed lists, the grandmother's endowment. You're welcome to visit as volunteers or guests. You will not step inside as owners. Greg cleared his throat. This is fraud, elder fraud. We can fight this. I let the silence settle before saying softly, you erased me. You called me dead weight. You took what was not yours to pretend it was inheritance. But I was not quiet enough, and I ensured I would never disappear. Heather sobbed again. We're ruined, our reputations, our lives. I turned my head toward the house behind me. I am not sorry. Your plans did not require me, your future did not acknowledge me, so I created a future I belonged in. I paused. Now, you're missing more than your vacation. Greg stepped forward, voice low. Mom, I'm sorry. I looked at him for a long moment. When I spoke again, my tone was quiet, unforgiving. You had years to say sorry, but you chose silence. Now the silence is on the other side of the door. Then I turned and began up the steps again, cane clicking, each wrench of wood under my foot echoing finality. I walked through the door they could no longer open. I paused in the hall, then closed the door softly behind me. Heather's cries grew muffled. Greg stared at the locked gate. The officers watched. The sun set across the lawn where magnolia petals drifted down, untouched by foreign hands. They could not cross that threshold, not because of law, because I had reclaimed what they believed they stole. And inside that house I was safe, rooted, remembered. I arrived at the senior center 3 days after the showdown at the house. I wore my navy blue coat and clasped the copy of the local paper under my arm. On the cover, a banner across the top, bold and crisp. Grandma from Florida takes back dignity. Heirs shocked as widow remains home. The photo showed me standing firmly on my porch, latch in hand, gate behind me shining under morning sun. Below, the caption read, Leah Collins, 82, transformed her own erasure into empowerment. By midday, the story had gone viral. Social media threads exploded. Grandmas deserve respect, widows who remember. I found messages in my inbox, some from women I had never met. Thank you for fighting back. I thought I was the only one who had been given crumbs. You gave me the courage to look up my power of attorney. I carried my tablet to the event. The room filled with folding chairs, soft light, and dozens of older women, some with trembling hands, others with calm faces like decades of endurance had taught them strength. I opened by telling them the same airport story, but I did not linger on the betrayal. I said, if someone hands you a standby ticket instead of a hug, look down to see what they forgot to take. Your name, your rights. I spoke about legal rights for elderly women, wills, property deeds, powers of attorney. I explained how to structure ownership, how to guard against manipulation. I passed around handouts, basic legal rights for older women, simple, bullet-pointed steps. A woman in the back raised her hand. She said, my daughter took my signature to open credit accounts. I don't know what's happening. I offered to review her documents after, quietly. Another woman, tears glistening, said, I was told the house I built was too expensive to maintain. It's in someone else's name now. She clutched her purse and nodded. I told her, we form a circle, we remember, we reclaim. After the event, reporters from the local TV station approached me. I spoke again, camera rolling, softly. This was not about revenge, it was about memory. I surrendered nothing but silence. My house, my ring, my voice, they tried to erase all. I remembered. Greg and Heather's names appeared in the second segment of aired news. Pierce sued by elderly survivor, allegations of asset theft and forgery. They had received subpoenas. Their attorney had notified them that accounts were frozen. Their alleged activity would be investigated for elder fraud, forgery, theft, and tax evasion. Within a week, documents confirmed by IRS and the Florida Department of Revenue had audited their tax returns. Heather's accounts were flagged for receiving tax deductions she was not eligible for, deductions claimed under my name while I moved into the foundation's legal structure. Greg's position as board member of the family business was suspended pending review. Local lawyers called for me to appear at roundtable legal events. A nonprofit elder rights group invited me as guest speaker with the theme, "Justice Doesn't Expire." I agreed, though I wore no medals, had no campaign, just stories and documents. When the judge dismissed the initial motion filed by Greg and Heather to regain access to the house, one anchor summed it up. Today, the court reaffirmed that elder dignity is not a gray area. It is the bedrock of due process. Never showed at the hearing. His name was listed, but only Heather raised her voice. His silence, once so familiar, now shielded nothing. In that moment, I felt something shift, not vindictive power, but settled resolve. I had been quiet for decades. Now, I had become a voice. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived from the Department of Revenue. It addressed Heather's violation. She claimed caregiving tax credits under my name, long after I moved into my new apartment and began working with the foundation. The fine exceeded her wedding ring's value tenfold. Interest and penalties posted. Her face appeared in the online headline, "Family Heiress Hit with Massive Elder Tax Fraud Charges." Greg's name followed under Business Journal coverage. Once the rising star of the firm, now the subject of corporate scandal. Once it was revealed he had exercised supposed power of attorney to sign corporate documents as if he were me. Through it all, I remained grounded. I returned to the senior center to run my workshop again. I had 14 women that day, older, wiser, fierce. One called it the liberation class. I corrected her. No, this is just remembering who we were before we forgot we mattered. The local paper followed up months later, a full-length profile headlined, "From Baggage to Beacon, How One Woman Transformed Betrayal into Community." I hung that article in my living room, laminated it, and placed it near my teapot. It was not about me. It was about the idea that memory matters, that justice doesn't require shouting. Sometimes it only needs a signature, a deed, a moment of resolve. Because the truth remembered always outlives the silence they count on. I opened the letter in early autumn and felt something inside me shift. Heather had been terminated from her position at the investment firm, a company she had helped her husband promote as his crowning achievement. The press had leaked the story. Heirs accused of elder fraud and tax evasion. She was gone. Her name blacklisted. Her LinkedIn profile stripped of titles. Greg fared no better. The board's legal team moved swiftly once auditors uncovered his corporate maneuvers. He was removed from the board of the family business. Peers who formerly toasted his success no longer returned his calls. The shiny veneer of prosperity cracked, and behind it lay a reputation disintegrating. Several weeks later, after the dust settled, they came to see me. Greg, stooped as if the weight of the scandal had pressed the daylight from his spine. Heather, mascara-streaked, shoulders trembling. They stood at the foot of my current porch, the same porch where two adults once called me dead weight. I answered the door myself. "The door is locked," I told them. Heather swallowed, voice quivering. "Mom, can we please talk?" Greg spoke softly. "Mom, I want to say I'm sorry." I closed the door a half-inch without turning the key. "You had years to say sorry. You chose silence." I replied without looking back. Heather's voice wavered. "Please, I didn't know. I thought it would be easier. I thought I was helping." I turned, face calm. "You erased me, Heather. You erased my mother. You erased my memory." I paused. "But not any longer." Heather clenched her hands together, tears dropping without sound. I'm so sorry. For the ring, for the house. Please, can you let me have the ring back?" "Just that?" Greg watched, silence heavy on his shoulders. I met Heather's eyes. The ring of my mother glinted in her purse, the same ring she regarded as a trophy. Now it felt like a symbol of everything she'd stolen. I answered quietly, "No, that ring was never a gift. It was a covenant. I gave you nothing." My voice carried like an echo, firm, unbroken. Heather shook her head, small sobs rising in her throat. She looked at Greg. He mouthed 2 words. Go home. They turned and walked away, the gate swinging shut behind them with a final click. Inside, I closed the door completely. No lock, no latch. The boundary had been drawn. My life regained momentum. The scandal did not restore my wealth, but it reaffirmed something stronger. Respect due. Dignity reclaimed. Neighbors left me homemade cookies. Local lawyers invited me to speak further. A niece flew in to apologize and help me tend my magnolia blossoms. A month later, I received word that Heather's bank account would remain frozen pending settlement, and Greg had lost his position permanently. They could rebuild, but they would have to do it outside the boundaries they had once overstepped. I sat in my living room, sunlight streaming across the hardwood floor, and finally allowed myself to breathe. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the deed, and I stood in it, steady as I had been at the airport, at the foundation signing table, at the locked gates of a legacy they thought they owned. No more silence, no more erasure. I remembered, they remembered, and the rest was history. I used the house they thought they owned and breathed new life into it. The rooms where dust once settled now hum with soft conversation and possibility. I founded the Widows Who Remember Foundation using the assets I reclaimed. The house, the clinic shares, the investment account, all placed into its legal structure with strict bylaws preventing sale or dispersal. The mission: protect older women who have been erased, abandoned, or silenced. I hired caseworkers and arranged basic legal rights for older women workshops in the former parlor. Every Thursday morning, the front door opens on a pot of coffee, gentle music, and women gathering, some with trembling hands, some with proud posture. They bring documents, wills signed in pen they no longer trust, POAs signed under pressure, deeds little understood. I walk them through each line, empower them to take control, answer their questions with patience I never had to demand. I teach estate planning, guardianship rights, trust law basics in plain English, not legalese. The old house was transformed too. The living room became a community library filled with women's memoirs, legal pamphlets, cookery books they can come and read or learn. Upstairs bedrooms became quiet rooms where women can rest during hearings, have a warm meal, or simply regroup. The garden hosts small therapy sessions, journaling under magnolia shade, shared tears, shared laughter. We call it the hearth. Light pours through the windows, new paint brightens corners. Heather once deemed tacky, and the ring I refused to reclaim now sits in a glass case, untouchable, untarnished, a symbol of a covenant kept. One evening in early winter, we held a memorial for what was lost. It was not for someone who had died, but for someone who had died in memory. We placed Greg's photograph at the center of the circle, a young man smiling, hand in mine at his graduation. His ashes had not been spread. It was his spirit I mourned. I invited each attendee to light a candle, one for each betrayal, one for each voice reclaimed. They held their flames with steady hands, tears in eyes, solidarity in silence. Jacob, my grandson, placed the central candle beside his father's photo. He turned to me, face soft and uncertain, and asked quietly, "Grandma, is Bad gone forever?" I looked into his warm, honest eyes. I stroked his hair, smelled the cinnamon from a nearby candle. I answered, "Better. Bad waits. So does love." There was a hush, not of grief, but of shared understanding. The candles flickered, as if responding. That night, we walked home slowly, Jacob carrying his father's photo, Ellie beside me, warmth in our hands and hearts. The night sky was dark and still, but the house glowed behind us, windows alive with quiet purpose. In that moment, I breathed peace for the first time in years. Not relief exactly, but resolution. I had never asked for applause. I had only needed truth, and truth had lived. Justice had lived. Justice had reached into my savings, my legal signatures, the heart of that house, and pulled out dignity. Not loudly, steadily. Later that week, I attended a gathering at our community theater. The theme was Justice Doesn't Expire. I stood on stage in my navy blouse with silver buttons, the same one I wore after the verdict dismissing Heather and Greg's lawsuit. I spoke plainly. Justice came, not in noise, but in presence. They called me dead weight, but they came home to nowhere. Justice didn't shout, it stood, So did I. The audience rose, not with fanfare but stillness. People of all ages, from all walks of life, caregivers, grandchildren, women who told me later, "Your story reminded me I mattered." Afterwards, a young woman shared through tears how she faced elder manipulation in her family. I held her hand. I told her subtly, silence is not neutral. Now the foundation continues to grow. We host monthly legal clinics. We partner with local law schools for pro bono volunteers. Local journalists still cover our workshops. I see women I once taught, testifying in court for themselves, rewriting wills, standing up in front of loving but misguided families. We operate on a simple principle. Every voice is weight, not dead weight. I keep the laminated newspaper clipping on the kitchen table. Beneath my teapot, I place that voice of community recognition. From baggage to beacon, how one woman transformed betrayal into community. I reread it sometimes, not for pride but as reminder. Memory matters, and women who remember matter even more. To the women listening now, if someone hands you a standby boarding pass instead of a seat, look down for what they forgot to bring. Your name, your rights, your future. Take the quiet steps to set things right. This channel, Grandma True Stories, is where those quiet women speak. We remember so the world does, not because we shout, but because we hold fast. If my story stirred buried courage in you or someone you know, please subscribe, because no woman is too old to rise, no life too silent to claim justice. Remember, justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply stands, and so do we.